Using our 19mm socket, we're going to go ahead and remove our lug nuts. Grab your wheel, remove it, set it aside. Using a 10mm socket, let's go ahead and loosen and remove this bolt right here for our ABS wire bracket. Once we have that screw out, I'm going to follow that wire up to this bracket right here. I'm just going to slide this rubber piece with the harness right out of that bracket. And set that aside. Using a 12mm socket, let's go ahead and loosen and remove this bolt here. We're just going to throw that bolt right back on the knuckle once we remove this. Now, with the key in the on position, we can now go ahead and manually crank our wheel like so. I'm going to go ahead and loosen and remove our nut on the bottom of our tie rod end. Using a pair of pliers, we're going to go ahead and grab the ends of our cotter pin here. I'm going to straighten these out the best we can. Let's go to the other side of this here, and we're going to pull that cotter pin out. We're going to use the pliers, try and catch us, and use the nut as leverage to go ahead and work that cotter pin out. Using our 19mm socket, we're going to go ahead and loosen this nut. Now we're just going to go ahead and thread this nut back on a few threads. We're going to use a hammer and we're going to strike our knuckle to go ahead and release our outer tie rod. Go ahead and zip that nut off. Now with the nut removed, let's go ahead and pop our tie rod end out. Using a 17mm socket here, we're going to go ahead and loosen this nut for our lower strut Clevis fork bolt. If your bolt is spinning like ours, you can use a 17mm wrench on the other side to hold it. Go ahead and loosen and remove that nut. And we're going to go ahead and work that bolt out. We're going to use a 14mm socket to go ahead and remove our upper Clevis fork bolt here. We're going to use our hammer to go ahead and work our Clevis fork off of our strut. Using your pliers, we're going to go ahead and remove our upper ball joint cotter pin here. I'm going to go ahead and grab the head of the cotter pin, try and work this out. Ours is in there pretty good and it's pretty rusty. I'm going to try using a pick to get through the eyelet here. I'm going to try and use our pliers here now with a little bit of leverage and go ahead and work the cotter pin out. There we go. Using a 17mm socket, we're going to go ahead and remove our upper ball joint nut. Now what we're going to do is we're going to install the nut, just a few threads. Now we're going to go ahead and strike our knuckle, and this should release our upper ball joint. Just got to remove our ball joint nut here. Now you want to be careful, once this nut is released and this ball joint comes up, this knuckle can come forward, so you want to be prepared like so. We're going to use a strap here to go ahead. We're going to use this to secure this knuckle from pulling away. That way there we have that space to work with our strut. With the upper control arm separated from the knuckle, we can now go ahead and manipulate this Clevis fork down just so we can get that separated from the strut. I'm going to remove our 3 14mm nuts. These are 12mm for the other 3. Now be aware, once you remove this third one, the strut may drop out. So at this point here, we're just going to tuck our strut back up and in. Remove our Clevis fork from the bottom. Kind of pop that down and off again. And we're going to go ahead and work that strut out and over. Now we can go ahead and lower that strut down. And we're going to slowly remove it from the vehicle. Be careful of your ABS wire coming down. Now I want to go ahead and use our spring compressor here. You want to be super careful when operating this type of equipment. You may end up having to remove your strut and bring it to a local shop to have them swap these cartridges out for you. But we're going to go ahead and compress the spring so we can go ahead and remove the upper nut and drop out that lower cartridge. Now we're using a 14mm gear wrench on the top nut. We have our Allen in the top here to keep that center of the strut from moving here. Let's go ahead and try and loosen this nut. Now keep in mind, once this nut comes out, our lower strut cartridge will drop. Put my leg underneath. Let's get our tool removed here, and then we'll pull that strut out. You want to take your boot here and make sure you have the washer on the top. Actually, probably slide this in after. It might be a little bit easier. You're going to work the bellows up and inside the spring. You can go ahead and set that washer on the top of it. Insert your strut cartridge up through your bellows. Have the cartridge stud come up through that washer here. I'm going to go ahead and push the cartridge stud up through the upper bearing plate. And once we have the stud for the strut cartridge coming through, go ahead and install your upper washer, the concave side facing up. Put the upper nut on. I'm just going to thread that on a couple threads. At this point here, you want to make sure that you position the strut base proper. So you have the tail of the spring. We're going to rotate the strut around so that the tail of the spring fits right in this notch right here. Is critical to the operation and the fitment of this unit. Once that's in place, now I want to go ahead and tighten down our upper nut onto the cartridge. Now what we're doing is just put my leg up on the bottom side of the strut. hold that up so that the pigtail of the spring is in the proper location. And let's go ahead and tighten this down. Going to be doing the same thing, checking the upper spring. There should be a notch in the upper bushing. So by just rotating the upper bearing cap here, the pigtail fits right into the groove of the rubber bushing. As you tighten this here, it'll pull the cartridge up and into the spring. Make sure the lower part of the cartridge is in place. And we can go ahead and snug down this nut. Now I'm going to go ahead and relax our clamp here. At this point here, we can go ahead and remove our strut from our tool. Let's go ahead and install our strut. I'm going to bring this up. And we're going to go ahead and line up our strut here with our Clevis fork. So at this point, we want to remove our strap supporting the knuckle. And you'll probably reattach our strap to our control arm here, because we still want to keep this knuckle secured. Let's go ahead and bring our strut up kind of into position. Feed that up. We're going to go ahead and get our lower Clevis fork lined up with our strut and work that Clevis fork up and onto that strut. Now on the back side of your strut, there's going to be a little tab that is vertical. That tab should line up with a slot on the back side of your Clevis fork so they actually lock together. At this point here, go ahead and install our upper Clevis bolt. We did clean that up and we put some anti-seize compound on there. Now we just want to go ahead and I'm going to snug that down. Now we're going to feed our strut up into place and get those studs poking through on the engine bay area. And what we're going to do is we're going to hold this up and into place. I'm going to reach over the fender and install one of the nuts underneath the hood. Now I'm just going to try and thread this on as far as I can by hand. If you can get one on the other side as well, that'll be great. It's not mandatory. Just one in place is enough to hold that strut from dropping out on you again. What we're going to do is we're going to use our screw jack to go ahead and raise our suspension up and into that ball joint. I'm going to go ahead and line up our lower Clevis fork here, and we're going to use our screw jack to go ahead and raise this up a little bit. You can use a pry tool through the back side, put it into the hole, and you can kind of manipulate the control arm and that strut. And then once that comes through, give it a few bonks. Boom, right through. And go ahead and install that nut on the other side. Let's go ahead and install our tie rod. I'm just going to poke that through. Then we have our tie rod in. Just gonna go ahead and get our nut threaded on. And zip it up as far as you can by hand. We're gonna use our jack and we're gonna go ahead and start to compress our suspension here. I'm gonna bring that knuckle up into that control arm and then we'll get that nut installed on that. So once we have our upper control arm nut installed here, we're going to continue to raise up our suspension here. And we're going to do this just enough so that the vehicle starts to come off of our lift, or in your case, your jack stands. And the reason why we're doing this is before we torque our strut components and our upper ball joint and things like that, we want our suspension to be in its fully compressed or natural ride height positions. Right about there, the vehicle is just starting to come off of our lift. Let's go ahead and start to torque our suspension components. Let's go ahead and snug our upper ball joint nuts. We're using a 17mm socket to this. All right, once that's snug, let's go ahead and torque that down to 35 foot-pounds. Now we want to pay attention to the hole in our ball joint stud and our notch in our castle nut. If these do not line up where you can get a cotter pin through, what we're simply going to do is tighten this nut so that it lines up with our next slot here. You feed that through, and then we're going to use a pair of our cutters here. Just going to tap that in a little bit further. Grab this lower tab. Bend that over. And then we cut off the excess. We're going to use our 17mm socket and wrench, and we're going to snug this bolt down for our lower strut Clevis fork bolt. Once that's snug, we're going to go ahead and torque this down to 47 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and torque our outer tie rod and nut to 40 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and feed our cotter pin through. Going to bend our tab over. And we're just going to cut off the excess. Install our ABS bracket here. Get our bolt started. Let's go ahead and snug this down. Once it bottoms out, maybe another quarter turn. We're going to install our back rubber grommet right here. Just press that into the bracket. It'll snap into place. We're going to torque our upper Clevis fork bolt to 36 foot-pounds. At this point here, we can go ahead and slowly lower our jack back onto the lift or your jack stands. Go ahead and install your brake flex hose bracket here. And we'll snug that down. Let's go ahead and install the rest of our securing nuts here for our strut. We'll snug down the other three. Now there are two different torque specs for this series of 6 nuts. There are 3 larger nuts. These are going to get torqued to 41 foot-pounds. The 3 smaller nuts are going to get torqued to 16 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and install our wheel. I'm going to go ahead and get our lug nuts all started by hand, and then we'll go ahead and snug those down. Go ahead and torque our lug nuts down to 80 foot-pounds. Once you're done with this, you want to go ahead and bring your vehicle down and have it professionally aligned. That's going to help prevent premature component wear and help prevent some abnormal tire wear.